computer and send to you. Perfect. Rather than the cloud, because I don't know what the cloud is.
Okay. So thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to see all of you in person and on Zoom. So as you all know, my name is Chantelle, and today I will be presenting my master's thesis, which is titled "My Parents Won't Let Me: Adolescent Reported Barriers to Accessing Mental Health Care." So I'd like to start by thanking all of my co-authors, Isaac Ahuvia, Sharon Long, Julia Fassler, Dr. Catherine Fox, and Dr. Jessica Schleider for all of the support and effort that they put into this project alongside me. So to lay out the agenda, we're going to start with the introduction. We'll go over what we know about the research in this area, limitations to what we know, and then the present study. And then the procedures, then during the methods, I will lay out my procedures, the qualitative coding process, other measures that we used, and the data analytic plan. And the results, I'll lay out the descriptive statistics and the results by research question. And then discussion will discuss the implications of those results. And then we'll conclude on the strengths and limitations, major takeaways, and future directions. And then I will extend appreciation and gratitude. So let's get started with some background information. Mental health care access among adolescents is low. Depression is one of the most common diagnoses and is the leading cause of disability among adolescents, yet fewer than 50% of youth with depression access mental health care services. Depression in adolescence often causes significant suffering and impaired functioning, and is often life-threatening, as many adolescents experiencing depression attempt or die by suicide. And there are many adverse outcomes related to depression: poor school attendance and performance, risky use of drugs and alcohol, and binge eating, to name a few. It's imperative that youth can access care when needed to mitigate these adverse outcomes, among others. And understanding the barriers that adolescents face to accessing mental health care is the first step in working towards increasing access to care. Exploring adolescents' experiences described in their own words offers unique insight into the problems that they feel hinder their access to help. Although valuable work has been conducted in this area, there are limitations to our current understanding of the barriers that youth face to accessing mental health care. Much of the available literature on adolescent barriers to treatment center parent perspectives, which may not fully reflect adolescents' needs and experiences. And while there's certainly value in understanding caregivers' perspectives on seeking mental health treatment for the adolescents that they care for, there are also discrepancies between caregiver and youth perspectives. For example, caregivers have cited logistic concerns as a major barrier to youth accessing care, like lack of access to childcare and transportation, limited availability, while youth have cited concerns about the therapeutic relationship as a major barrier to care, concerns about whether they can trust providers, concerns about confidentiality. It's also important to note that oftentimes caregivers might not have a full sense of their teen's perceived treatment access barriers, and they might be unaware that their child is experiencing mental health symptoms at all. So efforts to dismantle barriers to care for youth require explicit centering of their experiences. Of the studies that do center youth perspectives, a majority require parental consent for teens to participate in those studies. So many adolescents are unable to contribute their perspectives because they're unable to receive that parental consent to participate in these studies. It's important to note that focusing only on the perspectives of youths whose caregivers are willing and able to provide consent for research participation might limit our understanding of youth from families with less supportive families. Also, youth might be more likely to share their experiences and thoughts if they're asked directly and privately. So the present study did not require parental consent for participation. So among the studies that have examined youth perspectives to barriers to care, there's also a lack of diversity among these perspectives. There's a lack of racial and ethnic diversity. Commonly, samples are comprised of white, non-Hispanic youth. There's a lack of perspectives from youth who are actively experiencing depression symptoms. No studies have exclusively sought the perspectives of these youth. And there's a lack of diverse sexual orientation and gender identities. Sexual and gender minority youth report higher rates of unmet mental health needs than cisgender heterosexual youth. And yet there's a lack of adequate representation of these groups in studies exploring the specific barriers to care. All youth deserve access to mental health care when they need it. And so it's important that we understand the specific, unique barriers faced by as many youth as possible so we can have a real shot at increasing access for all. Finally, many studies in this area rely heavily on quantitative, multiple choice measures that don't leave space for youth to share their experiences in their own words. As a result, youth are left with forced choice responses, limited options, researcher-identified barriers. But qualitative or mixed methods tend to have more flexibility to better capture the full diversity of youth's unique experiences, as they offer youth the space to directly report their experiences. And qualitative approaches might be especially crucial for understanding barriers faced by minoritized youth to capture any unique and potentially identity-related barriers. So that brings us to the present study. The present study aims to fill gaps in our knowledge of adolescent-reported barriers to accessing mental health care. So it's an exploratory follow-up study consisting of 123 US adolescents, ages 13 to 16 years old, all of whom report elevated depression symptoms. So using a mixed methods approach, I sought to characterize teens' self-reported barriers to accessing mental health care. This follow-up study uses data from a subset of individuals who participated in a randomized trial of online single-session interventions. And I also think it's important to note the ethical implications of working with youth who are actively experiencing depression symptoms. All participants in this study were offered a list of mental health resources. So the current study aimed to explore three research questions. First, what barriers do adolescents reporting elevated depressive symptoms believe keep them from accessing treatment? Second, how do these barriers relate to demographic and symptomology-related variables, so symptom severity? And third, how do these barriers relate to current perceived need for mental health treatment? And that brings us to the methods. So all procedures, measures, and analytic methods used in this study were pre-registered and approved by the University of Denver Institutional Review Board. All original study participants were recruited via Instagram advertisements to participate in that randomized trial. And all original study participants were 13 to 16 years old, fluent in English, and reported elevated depression symptoms, which was defined as a score of 2 or greater on the patient health questionnaire. 2. So recruitment took place over 4 weeks in the summer of 2021. Participants were randomly selected from the original study pool and invited via email to participate in a 30-minute online follow-up study. 281 teens participated in this study and received one $10 Amazon gift card as compensation. And of those 281 respondents, the current study includes 123 respondents. Why only 123 when there are 281? Great question. I would love to tell you. So participants had to meet 3 criteria to be included in the study. First, participants must want or have wanted support for mental health problems. 277 of the original 281 participants met this criterion. Second, participants must not have received support for mental health problems. So 135 of that 277 met this criterion. And finally, participants must have provided a written response to the open-ended question, what has kept you from getting support when you wanted it? And 123 of the 135 participants met this criterion. So we conducted a thematic analysis on responses to that open-ended question, what has kept you from getting support when you wanted it? Specifically, we engaged in inductive qualitative coding, meaning that we derived themes from the data rather than seeing how existing themes fit the data. All responses were coded using one codebook, which was developed collaboratively among the coders, Sharon, Julia, and myself. So developing the codebook. First, each of the 3 of us independently ran a random subset of 30 responses and developed initial coding categories from what we saw. Then we met to review those categories and develop a preliminary code book based on that. We then used that preliminary code book to independently code another random 30 responses. And then we met again to compare those coded responses, discuss any discrepancies, disagreements, and to revise and develop the final code book. Using the final code book, we independently coded another random 30 responses, and then I conducted inter-rater reliability analyses on those coded responses. So only responses where the kappa was 0.8 or greater were kept in the code book, and that meant that we were reliable. And for any code where the kappa was less than 0.8, we discussed and revised and until the kappa was 0.8 or above. And finally, we individually coded all of the responses, so 123, using that finalized codebook. And we ultimately settled on a total of 13 codes. So we also employed quantitative measures, as this is a mixed method study. So we had multiple choice questions capturing this data. We asked people their age, sexual orientation, which we coded dichotomously, so sexual minority or heterosexual, gender, which we coded in 3 groups: cisgender male, cisgender female, and gender minority individuals, and race ethnicity. Participants span the following identities: white non-Hispanic, Black or African American non-Hispanic, Asian non-Hispanic, other non-Hispanic, and Hispanic. And we use a single variable approach to assess race and ethnicity rather than separating race and ethnicity to avoid conflating responses from participants of varying identities. So all participants in this study reported elevated depression symptoms, like I mentioned. And in this study, we explored the severity of those elevated depression symptoms via the Children's Depression Inventory, second edition, short form, the CDI-2, which is a reliable and valid measure of adolescent depression symptoms. So we coded depression symptom severity dichotomously. So clinically elevated was operationalized as a score of 10 or greater, and subclinical was operationalized as a score of 9 or below. And Cronbach's alpha for the CDI-2 of the sample was 0.85, which is statistically acceptable. So for the data analytic plan, all data processing and quantitative analyses were conducted in R. And again, all analyses in the study were restricted to complete cases. Individuals who wanted mental health support did not get it and provided a written response to the qualitative question. So the plan per research question. So once the barrier for research question 1, once the barriers were qualitatively identified through thematic analysis, we evaluated and reported the frequencies of each barrier for the entire sample. For research question 2, we compared the prevalence of each barrier across demographic groups using chi-square tests. And for research question 3, we compared the prevalence of each barrier across current need for treatment using chi-square tests. And circling back to research question 2 briefly, it's important to note 2 considerations that limited the comparisons that I was able to make. So per our pre-registration, we did not conduct any comparisons with groups less than 25 participants. And we selected this cutoff to ensure that our estimates were sufficiently reliable. And per recommendations for chi-square analyses, we did not conduct any tests where the expected number of participants under the null hypothesis was fewer than 5. And this recommendation similarly exists to ensure that the chi-square tests were valid and reliable. So as a result, that means that we did not conduct comparisons across race, ethnicity, or gender, or sexual orientation. So we were only able to compare cisgender female participants to gender minority participants, participants who were above and below that clinical threshold for depression, and participants who perceived they needed treatment and those who did not perceive they needed treatment. So let's take a look at the results. So the vast majority of participants identified as having minoritized sexual orientations, specifically 84.6%. A majority of participants also reported clinically significant depression symptoms at the time of the survey. That was 69.1%. And a majority also reported current unmet need for mental health services. That was also 69.1%. So 13 barriers emerged from thematic analysis. And it's also important to note that in some responses, participants listed multiple barriers. So as a result, some responses were double or multiply coded. I recognize that this is a lot to look at and hard to read if you're in this room. So I will read the barriers out. We have financial concerns, general issues with family, lack of family support, discomfort sharing, logistic constraints, and others' beliefs about mental health. And I want to note the volume of participants who endorsed financial concerns. That was 27.6%, so more than a quarter, and general issues with family, which was 24.4%, so almost a quarter. Here are the remaining codes: having your feelings invalidated, feelings of stigma, therapist fit, insurance, lack of treatment seeking, wait lists, and other. I want to highlight the other code. 20.3% of participants, so that's a fit, listed a barrier so unique and specific that it could not fit under any other code, nor could it be combined with even one more response to form its own code. So of the 13 barriers identified, adolescents in our sample endorsed the following barriers most frequently: financial concerns, general issues with family, other, and lack of family support. It's also notable that 61% of participants reported one barrier. However, 31.7 reported two, and 7.3 reported three or more barriers to care. So for research question 2, comparisons of barrier endorsement by gender, specifically cisgender female compared with gender minority individuals, are presented in this table. Cisgender male participants were excluded from this analysis due to small sample size. And again, it's important to note that some codes were not tested because they were too infrequent for the chi-square test to be valid and reliable. So these groups did not differ on their endorsement of 5 of these 6 barriers. Gender minority participants were more likely to endorse lack of family support as a barrier. However, this effect was no longer statistically significant after p-value correction. Comparisons of barrier endorsement by depression symptom severity are presented in this table. Same constraints as I listed before. Participants did not differ in the barriers that they endorsed by depression symptom severity of the barriers that we were able to compare. Comparisons for research question 3, comparisons of barrier endorsement by participants who reported that they currently need versus do not need treatment are presented in this table. So same deal, same codes were not tested because they were too infrequent. Participants did not differ in the barriers that they endorsed by current perceived needs across financial concerns, general issues with family, lack of family support, and other. So what could all of this mean? Let's discuss. So barriers to mental health care access are complex. 39% of participants reported multiple barriers to accessing mental health care. Past research on accessing mental health care has often only focused on one barrier, for example, stigma. However, this study's findings imply that focusing on only one barrier might leave important information out. In addition to the 12 barriers identified, a fifth of youth reported 25 additional barriers, so unique that they were best coded as other. The quantity and range displayed in these reported barriers illustrates how complex barriers to accessing care really are. And we need to continue centering youth voices so that we can capture this complexity in our work to ameliorating barriers. Participants agreed on the top barriers regardless of identity. So financial concerns, general issues with family, and other were endorsed nearly equally across groups. These were, recurring barriers, whether participants felt that they needed treatment at that time or not. And so there's value in honing in on these barriers. So that's what we'll do. Financial concerns and family-related issues emerged as prevalent barriers to mental health care access in this sample. Financial concerns is, of course, a prevalent barrier, so let's start there. Almost a third of participants endorsed money-related concerns, specifically the financial concerns and the insurance barriers. While past research on barriers to mental health care has had similar findings that money is a stressor, the present study identified slightly different versions of financial concerns that are often noted. Specifically, adolescents are expressly concerned about burdening their family finances. Several participants viewed mental health support as a financial burden and noted that they don't want to add any financial stress to their parents. And many also pointed to insurance restrictions. Broadly advertising free-to-use mental health supports for teens may help address this barrier. So it's important that we make mental health supports free to use. At the same time, though, it's important that we are loud about existing free-to-use mental health supports. Shout out the Lab for Scalable Mental Health. We need to share these free supports broadly to increase awareness of their existence by informing adolescents directly. This way, youth in need can both access support and understand that they incur no cost. Family-related issues is another prevalent barrier to care. 42% of teens reported family-related barriers making mental health supports, 42% of teens reported family-related barriers, right? So making mental health supports directly accessible to teens without requiring familial support may help teens overcome this barrier. Several participants noted being discouraged by family members' negative beliefs about mental health, by not having the support of their family, and by having their feelings invalidated by family members. And these findings are in line with prior research on this topic, that family members' views on mental health can be a deterrent for youth who desire professional help. Parent and family psychoeducation on mental health concerns and treatment may help alleviate impacts from this barrier. And making supports available to all family members may prove helpful as well. Framing the support as activities to increase communication and understanding within families rather than as mental health supports may be helpful, as several participants indicated that their family does not regard mental health supports positively. So I'd like to zoom out for a moment to address the broader context of family-related barriers to youth accessing mental health support. State laws regarding age to consent to mental health treatment without parental permission impact teens' ability to access desired care. So 1/3 of states have mandated caregiver consent for youth to access mental health treatment, which often suppresses treatment accessibility. In a 2025 study coming out of this lab, actually, treatment use among adolescents who recently experienced major depression was significantly lower in these states, which prohibit them from independently consenting to mental health treatment. Given that this study presents perspectives from youth 13 to 16 years old, it's worth noting that family-related barriers were endorsed at higher rates compared to other barriers. And the findings of this 2025 study, coupled with the findings from my study, highlight the critical importance of teens having the ability to access support on their own. Conclusion. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the study's strengths and limitations. The study had two major strengths: a diverse sample and the use of mixed methods. The study's diverse sample allows for diversity in perspective and insight into unique experiences. And the qualitative nature of this project allows for insight into the complex nature of youth experiences to barriers to care. And few studies have leveraged qualitative methods in a diverse sample to address the goals of this study. The study also has several limitations. One limitation of the study is that there were inadequate representation among several groups, unfortunately. So, for example, boys and literally all racial minority groups. So the small number of participants from these groups limits our ability to generalize these findings to these groups. And it also limited our ability to test differences and barriers faced across these groups. Even when across-group comparisons were possible, small sample sizes limited our ability to detect small differences between groups. And additionally, we were unable to explore the regional differences, which, as we could see from the last slide, are important. Different regions have different concerns, and since we didn't collect region-specific data, we were unable to explore regional differences. So what should we take away from this? Barriers are numerous and complex, and we need to take this into account in our efforts to increase access to mental health care for all. It is not a one barrier blocks all situation, and we shouldn't treat it as such. Financial concerns and family-related issues emerged as the most prevalent barriers, and participants agreed upon this across identity, depression symptom severity, and perceived current need for treatment. So bolstering efforts to make mental health supports free and accessible without parental consent may be particularly impactful. Future directions. So future studies should make efforts to have adequate, equal representation among groups to strengthen results, explore regional differences to increase understanding of which barriers are most prevalent in which places, and explore other demographic factors such as socioeconomic status, cultural background, and religious background. All of these considerations may offer new insights for future work. Future studies aimed at targeting the most frequently endorsed barriers, again, the financial concerns and the family-related issues, may prove particularly useful in efforts to increase mental health care access for teens. Youth continue to face numerous barriers to accessing desired mental health care, and this study highlights the need to center and amplify youth voices in efforts to increase mental health care access. Acknowledgements. So first of all, thank you all for listening. I'd like to wrap up by extending my appreciation. So first and above all, thank you, God, for making this work possible, and I'm grateful to Jesus for bringing me in this project to this point. I am also extremely grateful to the participants of this study who selflessly shared their experiences, to Dr. Schleider for your encouragement and guidance throughout this project, to my co-authors for the work that they put into this project, to my committee members for serving on my committee, thank you, and to all of you for your attention and support. And special shout out to Isaac for the lessons in statistics and R. Here are my many references. And thank you. Any questions?
There's like reaction from chat.
Oh, yeah.
Perhaps just their name title.
That's so cute.
Oh,
That's so cute.
Oh, my mom. Oh, that's cute.
Oh, that's adorable. Well, first of all, it's so delightful and heartwarming to see everybody on Zoom joining in this parade of support for Chantel's success. So thank you all for coming. And we've talked about this project for 3 years now.
Yeah.
So I'll let other folks start with questions and then I can jump in afterwards.
Sounds good.
I was curious, I know you mentioned that some of the different responses were categorized as other. What were some of those examples of them?
I can pull up the table. So some of the examples that I listed here, sorry. Shout out to the ladies. So my own skepticism, one person mentioned I didn't want to go to the school counselor because I didn't want it on my record. There are 25 of these examples that I can share, but only these two are listed like on this slide. But this entire table and the whole code book is available on OSF. So anyone who's curious about these 25 responses, you can read them all. But yeah, these are just the two that I listed here. I can't keep
Too many people
Literally.
love you and support you.
And I might have missed this somewhere too. Did you look to see if number of barriers endorsed, was it significant across like different demographic groups?
No, so I did not compare, the volume by group. Just noticed that a majority reported 2 or more. But yeah, that would have been interesting to see like the number of barriers endorsed by different identities and what that looks like.
Yeah.
I have hypotheses, but nothing great.
Yeah, no. And then I think something else that might be interesting to add too is looking to see if any of the endorsed barriers like clustered together, because that might then help reduce the number of different variables that you're looking at. And it could be interesting to see if they form like their own unique themes in a way.
That is really interesting. I really like that idea. As a general statement, barriers and facilitators work I'm like very into, so I feel like that's something to take into account for future work for sure.
Mhm.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Wonderful presentation. I really appreciate how thorough you were in your description of the whole process. And this seems like truly a labor of love. So I hope clearly people are proud of you, and I just most importantly hope that you're proud of yourself, and it's an important contribution. So I have a number of questions. I know you mentioned that the literature thus far has focused on stigma. You and I talked about this before. What was your ultimate decision not to include the self-stigma seeking help scale in your analysis?
Yeah, I didn't know about it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I didn't know about it at the time.
Because even some of your responses, that
Yeah.
category, it's a lot of conflation with stigma. And I even think around the family-related issues, that
Yeah.
barrier, how that
It's a lot of
conflates
stigma.
with
Yeah.
stigma. And then when you think about these subgroups, what stigma looks like is different, right? Based on socialization. So I think your analysis, and again, you can't do this retrospectively, but just even thinking about that critically for next steps.
Yeah.
On yes, the literature has talked about stigma, but just think about who has talked about stigma, whose voices are dominated in the stigma space.
Yeah.
Because stigma for people that are socialized like you and I is very different from other people in various different ways of socialization,
Totally.
right?
Totally.
So.
Yeah.
I did have a question about your implications related to the family related issues. So you recommend, I think it's related to the financial concerns implications, yeah, if you wanted to go to the slide. So thinking broadly about the implications of this work, free to use mental health supports, yes.
Yeah.
But how that is again conflated with family related issues. So I think in this sample they reported more so financial concerns related to like insurance status, family burden. And so single session interventions are very important in that context. But then when you need the wraparound care, and so family involvement, how do you think about what that would look like in the current political landscape? And this is open, like, you know, for you to, of course, think about your work moving forward in the current political landscape and for minoritized groups that are being targeted.
Like what could family, what could increasing like family psychoeducation, family access to mental health services, free to use services for youth beyond just a single session intervention look like in this landscape? Am I understanding that?
Yes, you are. Especially as someone, so my background, and you kind of know, I do a lot of work with Chicago Public Schools, and we're thinking about this critically. Like we do student workshops, but then we also do parent workshops separately, but there's still a need. Like that standalone, it's clearly a need. And when thinking about what the demographics look like in Chicago Public School, and I know it's slightly different from the sample that you had, but what do you envision? What could that mean? Like we're saying free to use, but like is that feasible in the current landscape?
Well, I do think schools are an extremely critical place to start, like you mentioned, and I know that Katie, you're doing this work. I think up until the age of 16, it might be older, but teens are like required to go to school. Okay, so these are places that they are already. And if we can implement these free to use resources there, where they can access it more easily and maybe even send kids home with things for their parents. And again, being mindful of the wording, right? Maybe mental health supports for families isn't the way to title that. Maybe like increasing communication or whatever feels best to the receiver. I think that could be a really critical place to start because we're starting where people already are and then having them bring what they find useful into their homes and starting that conversation within themselves. Regarding the current climate, I know.
That's all I needed.
Yeah. How just one, I'm not sure, but I'm inspired by the work that you're doing and that we're doing despite or in light of all of this. It's still being done, albeit in a more difficult way.
I'd like to piggyback onto that really important question. So when you think about, and you already spoke to the framing issue, like focusing on communication and family ties, as the outcome rather than depression or mental health or identity, right?
Yeah.
If you were, say, approaching a school board and you were going to a meeting and presenting Project Yes, including Project Rise, we don't have to talk too much about that.
Yeah.
We can just Trojan horse it in there.
Okay.
But how would you think about strategically framing those interventions to a mixed audience of parents, let's say in a red state,
Okay.
where the issues of parental consent come up, where the issues of parental rights come up, right? And this general sort of antagonism towards mentioning anything identity related.
Yeah.
What would you say in that context if you had the floor?
I think I'd point to a few different things. I'd point to the purpose. Like, for example, I'd listed poor school attendance, poor school outcomes as things that are affected by depression. So I think I would ground it in those outcomes. Because I think that parents are probably more receptive to that, especially if they're not receptive to the whole mental health thing. So I'd start there, and I'd probably pose questions about just like, do you have any concerns about your child's attendance and how they're performing in school, and recognize like this is a resource that can help with that. I'd also give them as much information as possible. I think people are scared when they're confused.
Yeah.
Like they're scared when they don't know what this means. Like my kid gets to consent to something that I don't know about, like absolutely not. So answering all of their questions, being forthcoming with that information, and probably sending them home with some variation of like information packet with like information about like what Project Yes is and what it aims to do and what benefits it would have for their child and what potential benefits it might have for them as well by positively impacting their child. So I think that that's probably the route that I'd go. I'd also acknowledge and like validate the concerns.
Yeah.
Because also people get upset when they feel like they're not understood. I get upset when I feel like I'm not understood. So, I'd want to really like center and acknowledge the reservations and validate that.
And clinical training is useful, as it turns out.
Yeah, it is.
That's a really good response. And I ask this question not as a hypothetical, because we're going to be as a lab in this situation quite a bit. So hopefully, folks in this room will have chances to attend meetings like that where there may be a diversity of opinions to, troubleshoot different strategies like the ones you just named. But I think your project really highlights the problems, absolutely, but also the multi-level pathways forward. Like the barriers and facilitators work is so incredibly important because it points to those multi-level interventions that we need to focus on. So kudos for conducting such a rigorous, impactful project that's already been published in a leading journal for adolescent research. So it's a really impressive feat what you've done here. I've been there from the beginning and seen how many skills you've independently and collaboratively acquired to be able to do this rigorous research. And like they said, you should be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished here and the contribution you've made to this work in literature. So huge congratulations. I already asked my hard questions. So I think, well, we can open it up to, and does anyone else on Zoom or in the room have any questions?
That's nice.
I have one other question. And this is again just because I'm really interested in the project, the work that the lab is doing. One is if you can talk a little bit more about future direction and where you plan to take this, either with your dissertation or other side projects. Two, we mentioned school a lot. It seems like that is a space where a lot of us were, thinking of like the settings in which we're situated. And parental involvement, I think one assumption is that parents are involved in school to even begin those conversations. So one, and then two, how school is viewed from the lens of certain groups as a carceral place, and how do you work with administrators for them to understand that? Like school for people, I would assume in this room is very different than some kids who are having issues with attendance.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So in terms of kind of future directions and like where I'm taking this, I'm actually not involved in the school space.
Okay.
I'm taking us to libraries.
Yes.
So
Beautiful.
yeah, so it's clear again from the study, the financial concerns are major, family issues are also major. And with public libraries, one, these are free third spaces that teens are already frequenting, which makes my heart warm. And also parents don't have to be there.
There we go.
So teens are already seeking resources and supports, mental health, and otherwise in public libraries. And so I think embedding, particularly Project Yes, which is it's a website that contains 3 single session interventions, all free to use, putting that in the library where teens already are and are already calling for more supports, I think is a great way to like kind of get at these barriers and get through them, because again, it doesn't involve parents, it doesn't involve money, and teens are already there. So I hope to not have to speak to many parents. But I will prepare myself through all of the resources that this lab has if needed.
Yeah, it's needed, but I love what you're saying. You're kind of trying to go into a space that doesn't have that perception to certain groups, and it's more of a space of a reprieve where certain kids are voluntarily going to the library for various reasons. So that's beautiful. I forgot that you were going into the library space.
And I'm really pumped about it. And then the word that you used is so critical and voluntary. Like kids are going to the libraries because they want to.
Yep.
So there's already like a warmth there. And like research has already shown that like teens positively view the library.
Yeah.
So putting these resources in places where they already feel supported and already want to go, I think could really help increase access for a lot of people.
Do you have plans to train the library staff? Perfect. Just in case, yeah.
Yeah, that's part of it. It's all gonna be super collaborative. It's gonna be very cool.
So excited for you.
But yeah.
Also, just as a future direction, if you end up being interested, there are a lot of parents voluntarily frequenting the library too, but for their younger kids,
Okay.
right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
if you think in terms of a lifespan approach to prevention,
Yeah.
right, there may also be an opportunity to intervene on that level to preempt the barriers that their soon-to-be adolescent kids will potentially face.
Yeah, I love that idea. Absolutely. Exciting things.
Yes.
Thank
Your
you.
question actually reminded me of something else too, with respect to like the ways that stigma may come across in some of those other responses.
Yeah.
What was the average length of the responses that the teens provided?
They were pretty short.
Yeah.
Like some
Yeah.
kids did.
Yeah.
I think the longest response was maybe like 4 sentences.
Okay.
If that, like that was like rare. Most of them were brief. I should have like Zoom. Oh, hey. Didn't know I could do that. So like, for example, like this sentence, being told that I'm weak and it's just all in my head.
Mhm.
Or the fear and stigma against getting support, which again, I want to highlight that like many teens reported multiple barriers. So like this, I think that this code is others' beliefs about mental health. I could be wrong, but would also be coded as stigma, for example. So I just want to highlight the like double coding. But yeah, so relatively brief. This person just wrote one word, stigma.
No insurance.
No insurance.
Wow.
So yeah, this was heartbreaking in many ways, and also kind of empowering too, because it made me angry. And I was like, we need to do something about this.
No good therapies on my insurance.
Yeah. So I'm happy to share the link to this code book and also to all of the coded responses for anybody that wants to dig in further and feel inspired, or just curious.
No, I'm just mostly curious because
Yeah.
this is such wonderful work, and I think specifically for like Latino youth, for example, like responses such as like the fear and stigma against getting support, like I'd be curious to like could we apply like an existing framework to look to see if there's like something more specific that could maybe help inform like a larger theory, like a more grounded approach in interpreting this.
We have enough data across data sets, and another data set where we have this data is Project Yes, where we have majority Latino and Hispanic youth.
Wow.
So you could do that.
And these
Right,
responses are heavy responses. No, okay, the literacy that I was just
Yeah.
referring to, you just, wondering, like, so you're getting a certain sample, of you. Or do you plan to change that method when
For
you?
going forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in the libraries, my hope is to do in-person focus groups with them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the goal. Ultimately, I'll leave it up to the teens if they prefer to do Zoom. Like, I will not force anybody, but ideally, in my most ideal world, it'll be in person.
So far in the library, they're all doing, like, we've been doing in-person focus groups.
Yeah.
Yeah, you had a lot of constraints with this study because it was already like part of your
Yeah.
ongoing
Yeah.
national remote RCT and you didn't have a choice in
Yeah.
the methods that were available, but
It
the
was
fact that
also
you got this
2021.
out of a secondary data analysis.
Exactly, it's
Very.
very impressive, and the questions are just for you to think moving forward, honestly, you thought really critically. If we didn't have questions, it would, you're not, you guys for all that, so. It's so cool.
Is this before COVID, like when it was
This
collected?
is just after.
Oh.
Yeah, it was like
Yeah,
2021, you described that, wow.
The trial, we collected data for the trial from December 2021 to like spring 2020 or 2020 to 2021.
Gotcha.
And then this was a 4-month follow-up after that 3-month follow-up that we got extra funding for it.
Right in the middle of that.
February.
We should be so proud.
Thank you all, truly. And the questions, like, I'm excited by the questions and the considerations for going forward, and I'm super pumped about the library work. I'm feeling really inspired. And yeah, thank you all for being here super early on a Friday. And thank you all for, I'm pointing to the internet, for being here. Your support really means a lot to me. So thank you guys.
Open up the chat, you got a lot of just comments and everything.
Oh yeah, and then y'all can follow this chat. And if you feel, oh, you guys can.
No.
If you feel that went well, you guys can go ahead and fill out this form
Oh, yes.
so that I can receive a master's degree. Yes. And then thank you.
Okay, perfect. You did an exceptional job,
Thank you.
exceptional.
You noticed this space so well.
Oh, yeah. I had to remind myself, this is not her dissertation,
Right.
because it's so good.
Now,
It's.
But if you get an email from me in 2 years.
Oh, I will, I like that, you, Ashley, I know you have Ashley,
Yeah.
helping with the library space.
Today is the
Second of May.
How are you feeling?
I get scared every time I remind myself what date it's.
How close are you?
2 months away.
One, two, how many kids?
This is my first, so.
Your life is going to change.
So I've been told.
I'm telling you, I had my baby during COVID and I am still trying. I have a
Oh,
4-year-old and a 3-year-old.
I don't know that anyone ever really gets used to it, but.
And the
I'm
work that we
excited
do.
for it.
Yeah. Do you know what you're having?
A boy.
Those two that.
Oh, yeah, my baby first.
All three different.
Snow love. Like
It was
that
been
first
difficult
love.
to say, but I didn't decide at all. I just submitted my paper. I'm like, oh. And
I was
then
super sick
great,
too.
but for the one
First
starting
3 months were,
like all.
I don't know why they require us to
all
work
presented
during
in
that
a
time.
big.
Yeah, and
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 then
unrealistic.
there was no like.
And then, you know, I was like going for my boy from postdoc to.
And then this is like.
I was like, because I was waiting.
Right,
you don't want
have their own
section.
Oh, wow. It's all such a mess. Although they ask you about it even if you're not,
I know.
yeah.
They do?
Oh, yeah.
They're not supposed to.
Yeah, they don't
They're
care.
not supposed to, but they
Yeah,
don't.
they're just like,
Oh,
oh.
maybe don't close out because I want to read it.
Looking for daycares in the area?
Oh,
Like,
no.
5 years. Right. It's illegal. Oh, it's go, maybe
I was like,
6 years.
That is so
I know.
good.
Okay. The difference were a nice touch.
Well, not this one, April.
Mhm.
And that was.
Girl.
Thank you.
I literally had goosies, like I was.
Oh
like,
my gosh.
That was so amazing.
So are these all lab
So
members?
Truly. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for getting it at 9 o'clock on a Friday.
A lot of people online are
time.
family members.
Yeah.
and
I
from,
You to be there.
Stony Brook, where we were at before.
Thank you.
So I love that.
Yeah, but I'm a little sweaty because you know.
Yes.
No,
Okay.
it's just I was telling Franco I was having
Well,
all of that I was having.
like some of the restaurant, all of them stick out roommates, like
that's I need to wear
others.
purple suit
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
my slides are purple.
But then the rest of us here are lab mates.
You're
I'm actually not in clinical psych, I'm in it's the health sciences internship program.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm in my 4th year, my year is
Stress.
strange because I was at Stony Brook as well and then
Switched, yeah.
You were in the year 2025. Yeah,
Can you
and
literally
I
have a meeting
think year of doctoral
but
studies.
I am
What I'll say.
Oh my god.
Including the acronym is HSIP or
Yeah, it's a wonderful meeting.
do you ever work with Neil Jordan at all?
I don't directly, but
Okay.
Neil works with a lot of students in the program
Yeah.
and helps teach some of the classes. So I think
My dissertation chair in my clinical study. He is the director of the mental health services. So
That makes sense. Yes, yes, yes.
which is awesome.
He is
Yes,
chair for a
okay.
couple students I know
Yeah.
in HSIP.
Seeing you in this moment, I'm reminded of a book that so I need to bring it. Oh, wait. Black Enough. Collection of short stories. Yeah.
You're working in the school space?
So my dissertation is gonna be, will be focus groups with students, teachers, parents, administrators, and mental health professionals in schools. And that's aim one, and then ideally see what they think about the SSIs and getting various facilitators there. And then aim two would be bringing them all together in a community advisory group to think about strategies to address the barriers.
What school systems are you in?
Well, I'm working right now with the Lake Washington School District in Seattle because that's where one of my consultants already had a partnership, and so we were thinking we'll kind of like
Yeah.
get in with the already established trust that's there.
Miss Procrastinator.
There's it's been like so many things happening with the school systems that it's really hard.
Now we're CPS.
We're starting to like connections with CPS.
I feel like there were community help with those connections.
Yeah.
And so Office of Student Health and Wellness is who I work with the most because I do a lot in their traditional clinics. But I also partner with the Office of Office of Social Emotional Learning, OSEL. Please, I would love to.
Yeah, no, that would be awesome.
Yeah,
Now we're primarily talking about doing some, well, dissemination of digital SSIs across the school system, but